Welcome to the Team EF Coaching Cycling Performance Podcast, where we take information from the highest level of sport and make it accessible to all cyclists. I'm your host, Zack, and today I'm sitting down with Coach Colby Pearce for what will be a little bit of an exploratory conversation where we try to connect people with the consciousness of their movement patterns and how their movement patterns off the bike affect their cycling and how their movement patterns in cycling affect their movement patterns off the bike. Colby, thanks for coming all the way down to Medellin, Colombia to, we could let you guys in on a little secret for the podcast listeners. We are putting together a series of courses on these topics. So thanks for coming down all the way down to Medellin, spending a week in the mountains with me, putting together these courses and doing this podcast.
It's been pretty rough. You've taken me on some gorgeous rides. You've been stuffed me full of high quality steak and looked after me. So, it's been a struggle, but it's great to be here. And I've really enjoyed working with you and working with the crew and building the courses. So I really hope that people find them useful.
So this is a really tough concept, I think, for most people to understand. And for some reason, cycling is really a sport that attracts people who want to eliminate, as much as they love the complexities, they want to eliminate the complexities that exist in movement patterns in other sports, right? A lot of times people will say, well, cycling attracts the uncoordinated people. And the way I see that is that, okay, you're saying that cycling attracts people who want to limit their movement patterns. And in some regard, you can get away with some pretty novice level cycling without a lot of dynamic movement. At the end of the day, you get on your bike, you pedal, you go forward, right? The bike, and then you've mentioned this many times just in our various conversations, and I'm sure in a podcast that we've done so far, but the bikes are so good now that you can get on your bike, just pedal forward and go pretty fast, right?
That's true.
So the purpose of this podcast and all of the courses that we've put together is to break down each body part, right? And not every body part, but we did a course on the foot and the ankle, all about the anatomy of the foot and ankle, how you use it going through life, and how you use it in cycling, and how they both support each other or degrade each other in some ways. And we've done that for the foot and ankle, the hips and pelvis, and the spine. And so it's been a really impactful week of recording down here, many, many hours in the studio. And what we wanted to do in this podcast is really communicate some of the core concepts that we feel people should really understand that come out of these courses that you guys can take from listening or watching this podcast, if you're watching on video. So you can take these concepts and apply it to your cycling and hopefully find a tremendous amount of value in it. And if you are finding value in it and you want to learn more about it, then we have many hours of video courses for you to go and dive deeper in. Before we dive straight into it, I, for the first time ever, want to give a special thanks to a few of the companies that have supported us in the coaching side of the business, right? Cannondale has hooked us up with some amazing bikes. Thank you to Cannondale. I've been riding the new Super 6 Evo. I think this is Gen 3, right?
I think that's right.
It's the latest one, right? But it is an awesome bike. You're still on the System 6.
Yep.
And although it's like a discontinued bike from Cannondale, I'm still jealous every time I see you on it. So massive thanks to Cannondale for being a supporter of the coaching company. And also POC. POC is a company that has, hooked me, you, all of our coaches up with great product, and it's awesome kit. How do you like your POC stuff?
I love my POC stuff, and I really appreciate that POC is a helmet company that focuses on the message of safety in addition to just how well ventilated and how light their helmets are.
Yeah.
After all, helmets are for safety first. So I really like that aspect.
It's a bonus that they look cool.
It's definitely a bonus that they look cool, and POC has a unique aesthetic, which I appreciate.
Same here. So let's jump into the podcast. Colby, if I were to ask you, and this for the audience, sorry, this is going to be a very broad question, and this could get pretty murky, right? So we ask you to navigate through your soul, through the lessons that Colby will portray here on this podcast. If I were to ask you to describe the foot, the purpose of the foot, why we use the foot, how we use the foot in life and in cycling, how would you answer that question?
That is a broad question. So first, the foot is obviously an appendage, right? part of the chain of muscles that we use primarily in life. We use that in gait. So gait is walking, right? And if the foot doesn't serve its function properly in gait, then we'll have consequences either at the foot or ankle or further up the chain. So a lot of times people can have a very dysfunctional foot, a foot that's either too mobile or not mobile enough, not stable enough, or overly stable, we'll say. And that can run all the way up the chain into hip and lower back, even as far as the shoulder or into the cervical musculature. That's the muscles around the neck. So the foot is such an important foundation for movement. And as cyclists, I think it's easy to overlook this. Well, I'll back out even and say that as humans, it's easy to take walking for granted. It's just, as soon as we could walk as small children, we did, and we've been doing it ever since, most of us. And unless you've had a life-altering accident or a significant trauma that changed your ability to walk for a period of time, it's just so easy for us to take walking for granted because it's essential. It's an inherent part of everything we do. You go to the bathroom, you go to drink water, you go to have a conversation, you go to get in your car. These are all things that involve walking, and the foot is the foundation of that movement pattern. And we can extend this a little bit to say that cycling is really, in my opinion, fundamentally modified gait. Gait is extremely primal to human movement. If we think about human movement from an evolutionary biology perspective, we took a huge risk when we went from quadruped to biped. Right? We put our center of mass much higher. We went from 4 points of support to 2. We exposed our internal organs to threat. As opposed to a tiger, you see a tiger head on, you get mostly teeth and claws, right? But when I walk up to someone right now, it's like, where do you want to eviscerate me? In the throat, or take out my liver, or what? So we did that to gain height, to gain elevation, so we could see further. We developed our vestibular and ocular systems, so we had good balance. But in order for that whole system to work, for that evolutionary gamble to pay off, we have to walk over the ground with stability. And that means the foot is really, when you think about it, it's actually more of a proprioceptive organ. It senses the surface we're on, right? So to understand this, imagine you're walking a surface that you expect to be tacky or grippy or sticky, and your foot starts to slide. Think about how fast your nervous system responds when you get that unexpected slide. It's far less than a second, fractions of a second. The speed of the nervous system is almost instantaneous, because if you fall down, you're dead to the tribe. You break a femur in a primitive tribe, you're done. You break a pelvis, you're done. You're a tiger snack. So you can't serve the collective anymore. So the point I'm making is the foot plays such an important role in navigating and negotiating our environment. And unfortunately, cycling shoes tend to dull that ability and that proprioceptive sense of awareness down for various reasons we can unpack if you'd like.
So would it be safe to say that your perspective on it is that the feet are much like the hands in that they do connect us to the world? Absolutely. But to your point there, I think that, I'm on the barefoot shoe movement myself. And I think that, it's been a pretty rough journey actually for me, like taking foot health into consideration the last year and a half. And I will admit that it hasn't been easy since trying to improve my foot health. I've had plantar fasciitis twice, right? I am somebody that pushes myself, so when it comes to making changes, there are sometimes consequences for those who have done things, let's say wrong or not suboptimally I'm 36 now. So 36 years I've been jamming my feet into shoes that crush my toes, both in cycling and in life. And so the last year has been a really interesting transition for me, trying to really work on my foot health, mobility, dexterity, flexibility, all of these really critical fundamentals of foot health. But you bring up a really good point there in regards to the problem of the footwear that we use specifically in cycling. So what kind of problems can an athlete face by using footwear that's not really designed for their feet and might put their foot in sub-optimal positions and ranges of movement?
Yeah. So when we're thinking about off the bike, suboptimal footwear. Modern shoes tend to be overly padded, and they tend to have a lot of heel to toe drop, right? So that pushes your heel up higher than the ball of the foot, which will shorten your Achilles quite a bit, shorten your calf. Really shortens the whole posterior chain of muscles. That would be the Achilles, the calf, the hamstrings, the glutes, even all the way up into the lower back potentially. So that impacts your posture. It impacts how you can make power and force in various different activities, and it limits your range of movement. So if your foot is sort of always in this position when you're walking shoes or maybe you're running shoes, then you're going to learn to make power at those angles, right? Strength and endurance are joint angle specific, meaning it's the said principle, specific adaptation to impose demands. So you train a body a certain way, you get a very particular result. And that's what we're doing when we wear shoes and we take our 10 or 15 or 20,000 steps a day in that shoe that's got a big heel to toe drop. The other challenge with shoes that are excessively padded is, and the science is pretty clear on this, the more padding we put under the heel, the harder you will heel strike.
Yeah.
So you put someone in a really padded shoe and you send them out for a run. Why? Because you're dulling the proprioceptive feedback of that heel strike. You're taking away the ability for the nervous system to realize, this is a jarring impact. I can feel this all the way up and down the spine. We have to alter our gait pattern to not have this happen. Put a giant pillow under your foot and you just start smashing the heels into the ground.
It's kind of like when you're a kid and you go-karting and you know that the bumpers on the side of the kart track will protect you. So the driving with your friends kind of becomes about crashing into each other as opposed to like taking the fast lines and wanting to be the best go-kart driver. Yeah. Right.
Give someone some padding and they'll use it.
Yeah.
On the bike, we have cycling shoes, which have some of the same challenges. All modern cycling shoes just about have a significant heel to toe drop or heel rise. They also have a toe spring, which is sort of that feature of the shoe that pushes your toes up from the ball of the foot that almost makes it look like a Dutch clog. Right. And that's a carryover from old school shoe design, probably sometime in the early 1900s, I would guess. People just never really thought a different way about it. All modern cycling shoes, nearly all modern footwear in cycling is basically derivative. They took a really old school design. They made it carbon fiber because everything carbon fiber is better because bling. And stiffer, lighter is always better. More is always better. More carbon. So we did that. And then leather sucks because it's a little bit heavy. And if you get rained on, it takes forever to dry. So we're going to get rid of the leather and we're going to put a synthetic leather on top of the upper of the shoe. And just as a side effect that we don't really care about, that happens to be that the leather doesn't mold to your foot. Synthetic leather doesn't mold to your foot. So it won't conform to the individual bony landmarks of your foot over time. It just sort of relentlessly hammers those high points and gives you a void in the low points. So the contact stress or contact pattern of that upper, that synthetic leather upper, isn't uniform. It's very unevenly distributed. And that causes pressure points potentially, or numbness or pain, or the boa wrestling match, as I call it, which is like the shoe doesn't really fit quite right and I feel my foot moving around. So I crank it down. And then 20 minutes later, my foot kind of hurts and everything's falling asleep and then getting tingles and my legs don't feel great. I'm going to loosen it way up. And then another 10 minutes later, well, now I got to go hard again and my foot's moving around. So I'm going to tighten it down. Go back and forth and back and forth. So modern cycling shoes present us with these problems. One other big one is simply that modern cycling shoes are so stiff. We've got shoes that say things on them like stiffness index of 13. I don't really know what that means.
Right.
I think it's all a play on the movie Spinal Tap where the base goes up to 11. I'm pretty sure that's the inside joke, but I've never met the engineers who did that. So, but anyway, the point is like more is always better. Right. We're no longer at 10. We have to go to 13 or 15. And anytime we put a really stiff lever around the body or we use it as leverage, we increase the mechanical advantage of a particular joint. At least that's the theory. And we do so at the cost of the body making intrinsic force or intrinsic stability in that joint. So the shoes are so stiff on the underside that the arch doesn't need to generate any force or power. It just can be lazy. And so now we have this situation where you go out on a ride, you go for a long ride, maybe you ride for 150 Ks or 180 Ks, right? So that's 6-7 hours on the bike, depending on your terrain and your speed. And you're conditioning all these muscles. That's the point. One of the biggest objectives of training is to condition muscle groups. So you're conditioning the glutes and the quads and the hamstrings and the calves, and you're making all this force and you're smashing sprints and going up climbs and doing all the things. But because of this rigid lever, the foot can just lay in that shoe like a blob of jelly. So you're creating a delta in the conditioning levels of the leg muscles, the hip muscles, and the muscles of the foot and ankle. You're creating a separation between the conditioning levels of those muscles. This is problematic. So that's one reason why cyclists kind of suck at walking. It's another reason why cyclists are notorious for spraining ankles in the fall. Because what do? They race all summer, they get this huge aerobic base, they've got all this fitness, then they do their final race, they take 2 weeks off, they go party or rest or whatever they do. And then they're like, oh, it's time to start cross training. And they've got still this massive base of aerobic fitness. They have no ankle stability. Like, oh, I don't want to ride my bike. My coach told me not to ride my bike. I'll go for a run. Then the other problem is they're used to riding for like 4, 5, 6 hours. So they forget to translate that running is like 1-to-3 ratio, right? You go for an hour run, that's worth like 3 hours of riding.
Right.
But they forget that because they're used to the timeline of 2 hours. So they go run for 2 hours and they get an hour in and their ankles can't tolerate all the force that's made in their legs. Boom, sprain ankle.
Right.
So we have all these challenges that cycling shoes will present to us as they decondition our foot and ankle. And so our task, I think, as athletes, and even more important than that, as humans, is to make sure that we don't come too far out of balance. We don't want a lazy blob of jelly in our shoe, and then these super toned, fit muscles above that imbalance will likely cause us challenge. So our onus, we'll say, or our task, is to condition our foot and ankles, our toes, make sure everything is up to task, up to par for daily life, for walking, for carrying groceries up and down stairs, and so that when we ride the bike, we don't make our shoes, our feet and ankles a complete disaster.
That's interesting. Very well put. And I agree with everything you just said. And I think that it actually goes against the grain of what's being taught in the industry by quote unquote experts, or those who self-identify or are identified by a small micro community as experts, in that there is certainly a emerging market for those looking to minimize movement and engagement by doing things such as placing the cleats back. The claim is that, you want to run the cleat closer to the skeletal structure and eliminate any flexion or extension in the ankle itself at all.
Yep.
I'm personally very against this approach and much more on the side of full range of motion in all things we do. Where do you stand on that side of the fence? And how do you think that limiting your range of motion in your pedal stroke by doing things like moving your cleats back has an impact on your day-to-day life off of your bike and your performance ultimately long-term on the bike?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I can speak from my own personal experience because I went through this exact journey. So I'll briefly outline that just for utility, but more significantly, we always have our N of 1, which is non-trivial, but we also have to look, how do other people respond to the same problem? And as I've been a bike fitter for over a decade, I can say that I've seen athletes come to me with weak foot and ankles consistently. That's a consistent theme. It's not necessarily what I see all the time. Often riders who do have a good stability in their arches, their feet and their ankles, good control over excessive supination or pronation or inward or outward spiral patterns, if they do have good control, it's typically because they have a sporting history in other sports that really condition the foot and ankle appropriately. But that said, I think that, there is definitely a philosophy of bringing the ground up to meet the foot. That would be a common line of thought when you're talking about a footbed or supporting the arch or making an orthotic, and you want to match the shape of the rider's foot. They do that. There's various different ways to do this, scans and casts and all sorts of bits. But we do this and we make a footbed that matches the contour of the foot, and then we enclose the foot in this almost carbon fiber or extremely rigid structure with boas, and we tighten everything down, and we're effectively mummifying the foot, right? We're trying to isolate it and prevent movement. We're trying to make it completely static.
It's like a functional cast.
Yeah, it is. It's like a functional cast. That's a great description. And I mean, okay, let's take a step backwards for a moment. 2 big picture points. What is closer to life, movement or not movement? Life. I mean, look at a puppy. Unless the thing's asleep, it's wiggling constantly. Everything that is alive is moving. The more alive it is, the more movement it has, right? What happens when we get close to death? We move slower, we walk slower, we can't stand up straight. Eventually, if we're really in bad shape, we can't even get out of bed. So more movement equals more life. So do we want to mummify any of our body parts in sports? I would offer, that's a bit of an esoteric perspective, but I'm full of unpopular opinions as a bike fitter and coach. So there it is. But I don't think we want to mummify or cast the foot, right? This is really important. And so when we consider my own journey as an example, I was a kid who I've always been, we'll say, blessed with hypermobility in most of my joints. I've been quite mobile. Like, I was a guy I can straighten out my knees and put my hands on the floor in a forward bend, no problem. Been that way forever.
Oh, dude, we've seen it here in recording these courses. Colby is, most common, Colby is very flexible. You'd say,
yeah.
Right?
But we don't want to falsely glorify flexibility in endurance sports, because here's the way to encapsulate that, right? You can't fire a cannon from a canoe, meaning if I have a lot of force, but there's no way to direct that force, then I'm not going to be on target. So this is my task as an athlete. I've got very mobile joints. For me to learn how to generate cohesive power has been a whole adventure. My feet were dreadfully inflexible. I would stand and my arches would completely flatten. And no matter what I did, I had no capacity to generate intrinsic stability in that foot and arch under load. So if I tried to do a single-legged lunge or go to the gym and do a leg press, which are activities I don't do anymore, but in high school and college, I did this a lot. I was training for cycling. So these were the activities I was doing, and I was watching my arches just flatten. I couldn't really figure out what to do about it. And my feet became worse over time, more flexible. And I kept feeling this sense of a loss of control of the foot in the shoe. And this challenged me. So I went to stiffer shoes. I found orthotics. I found custom shoes. I had custom orthotics made that were quite stiff. And over the years, that progressed. I got stiffer and stiffer shoes and stiffer footbeds until in 2004, I raced in a custom carbon shoe with an integrated custom orthotic. I mean, literally just a carbon fiber boot, a functional cast, like you said. And okay, here was my second point about big picture. When you broke your elbow in the 70s, doctors would put you in a cast for somewhere between 1 and 6 months, depending on the type of break, and you were completely immobilized. And what did we learn? Then you take the patient out of the cast, and it takes them 3 months of PT to get their range of motion back.
Right.
So doctors figured out, the medical industry figured out, like, this is a bad idea. Immobilizing a joint, even for healing, is bad. So they've completely changed their model now. We don't, unless it's absolutely necessary for the patient's life, like if somebody breaks their neck, you have to immobilize them to make sure they don't, snap their spinal cord or damage their spinal cord. But in the case of a joint or a femur or whatever, like, we get movement in the joint as soon as possible. That's part of rehab. Right. So why are we functionally casting riders' feet in shoes? This doesn't quite add up to me. But years later, I figured out that this model of an extremely stiff carbon fiber footbed, later in my career, I was using a Bond shoe, which is the stiffest shoe on the market, just about. And my foot was a disaster. And I just realized that I needed to start working on the function of my own foot. And I began, like you have, to wear more barefoot-oriented shoes with zero heel to toe drop, wider toe box, less padding. And I began to walk through those with daily life. And it took me many, many years to gain some stability and a sense of intrinsic tensegrity, we'll say, in my foot and arch. Tensegrity is the combination of integrity, tension, and integrity in one concept, right? In one structure.
So I can relate with you on much of your story. My story was, in fact, very similar in exactly what you just described. So I won't repeat it, but many visits to many different what do you call it? Podiatrists?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Many visits to different podiatrists, many custom insoles, many Band-Aid solutions, to the point where I was like, this doesn't work.
Yep.
And I started to take ownership and doing the exercises. I will say I spend about 80 to maybe 90% of my life. I'm fortunate to work from home, so I walk around the house barefoot. There's a no shoe policy in my house, as you know. Mm-hmm. So it's just barefoot. I love my floors sparkling clean, and the ability just to walk around barefoot and just work on those things all the time. If I'm not sitting, I'm standing, and constantly just trying to engage my feet. But I think the point you're making here is that we're designing shoes and orthotics for that matter, which you've just laid out, to eliminate all movement when it's movement itself that is the generator of force. So should we be eliminating all movement, or should we be maximizing the force that we can drive from the subtle movements and strengthening the foot to support force dissipation or force leaving the driving mechanism, or in this case, the cranks or the pedals? So I think that's the bigger part of the discussion here, is that footwear is not really designed for optimal performance. I think we can take a good measure from soccer cleats. Football, right? Well, football cleats are really shape-wise suboptimal. I mean, they're not designed that well, but there are many generations of athletes slamming their feet into these things, but they've taken out carbon fiber soles in football. Now the soles are plastic. Right?
They decided they were too stiff?
Yes.
Yep.
So they're back to strengthening their feet. And I will say that it's been very interesting for me to now be at the point where I finish an interval, let's say an interval that demands all of my focus and intensity just to get through the interval. And as I'm coming back to life and gathering my thoughts after blowing myself apart, I'm constantly thinking about the placement of my feet in my shoes and how my feet are, the anatomy of my feet, which is something that has not crossed my mind for the first 25 years I was a cyclist, right? So that's just a little bit of an interesting insight into, how you start to think about your feet and how you start to use them differently in the sport when you're focusing on strengthening them. And I will say that it's a beautiful feeling when you have strong feet and you get into a very force demanding scenario on the bike where you need to generate all force. Strong feet makes a difference. It is part of the force chain.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get into how we use feet in cycling to drive force and what the key things are we need to think about in engaging our feet in the pedal stroke.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The feet are the end point of the chain. We're making power, we'll say, or power originates from the hip and or knee, depending on the rider, the muscle group patterns, the amount of torque they're producing, and some other details. But we have to have that force be effectively transmitted through the foot and ankle into the shoe and into the pedal, and ultimately into the cranks, into the rear wheel. That's what drives the bike. So I think a lot of riders are in a similar position to you, Zach. They've never thought, or have rarely thought, about how their feet interact with the bike. It's more about just push hard on the pedal. And often that's a knee-oriented or quadricep-oriented perspective. Maybe you're thinking about the glutes. But the end result of that force can have a spiral pattern to it, right? And we can describe the pattern in common terms. We might say that a pronation pattern or excessive pronation, I prefer to call that an inward spiral. This is because I think pronation, most people associate that with a movement in a single plane.
Well, we were just talking about this today. Our shapes don't really fit the mold of describing movement in body because we have ball and socket joints as a I guess exaggerated way to look at it, and they don't move just
in linear. Well, right. Your hip is a ball and socket joint. Your ankle is a ball and socket joint.
And our even things like our elbows moves and knees.
All joints are triplanar.
Exactly.
Ultimately.
Yeah. So sorry, continue with your thought. I just wanted to.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So I think of movement, even pedaling, as has a bit of a spiral to it. And the question is your spiral pattern, all movements are really spirals for me, is your spiral pattern out of balance? Does it have some organization, or is it out of control? Are you pedaling unconsciously? Is your spiral excessive? So we would characterize a spiral, an inward spiral or a pronation spiral, as excessive pronation. That's too much rotation internally, and that's going to cause different challenges, right? And we talk about a lot of the specifics of that pattern in our course. We talk about the outcomes of that pattern and how to help you identify that pattern in yourself, whether that's you or not. The opposite of that would be a supination or excessive outward spiral, right? So the consequences of an internal spiral or an inward spiral is going to be the rider's going to feel excessive pressure on the base of the big toe, the first metatarsal. So I use my hand as a symbol for the foot. and if this is the base of my big toe, we'd feel that big toe smashing in, right? That's the dead giveaway. So if you feel a lot of pressure there, there's a good chance that your inward spiral is a bit bigger than we want. It's a little bit out of balance on that leg. The opposite would be an outward spiral, and that can register as either pressure under the fifth toe, the base of the fifth toe, or along the outside of the foot. And riders who have this excessive outward spiral sometimes feel as though their foot is almost going to fall off the pedal, right? Depends on where their cleat placement is and what kind of pedals they're on. And sometimes they go put a different pedal on, and that helps them. These issues are quite nuanced and sometimes require the experienced eye of a qualified bike fitter. But either of these patterns can result in problems up the chain. And curiously, often, in fact, many riders exhibit one pattern on one leg, one on the other, or more of a neutral stance on one leg and one either inward or outward spiral excessively on the other leg. And then, of course, you see right away, if you're experiencing those types of pressures at the pedal while you're driving the bike, what's happening up the chain at the knees, the IT bands, the TFL, the hips? How is that twisting you around the axis of the seat tube, right? And this gets into the global spiral pattern. So then we can naturally go to a chicken egg question. Well, is it the hips that are causing the spiral, or is it the feet that are causing the spiral? And that's a great question. I've been bike fitting for over a decade, and I can't answer that, not concretely and not globally. There are specific instances where I can say, we see that your right arch really is lacking integrity, and you've got a big inward spiral on that side. I think that's probably it's safe to say that's the driver of collapse in that pattern. And that's drawing the right knee in to follow. It's drawing the right hip in to follow. However, more often it's more of we don't really know what the cause is, but that doesn't necessarily matter. Now we know what the problem is, and we can apply tools to start to correct that movement pattern or optimize it, we'll say.
So the goal is to organize the movement pattern and the force driving mechanisms, right? Yep. And of course, strengthen them. I think that, and just to your point there, because I've experienced this, but a lot of times people don't know what's caused these imbalances. You might have fallen out of a tree when you were 4 years old,
sure,
and jacked up your hip, or gotten tackled playing high school football, and jacked up something in your back that has completely thrown off your spirals on either side, which can cause imbalances in your feet, believe it or not.
You have a surgery in your abdomen. Right? That puncture of the abdominal wall, that trauma, they take out your appendix, whatever it is.
So many things to consider here. But I think if we were to kind of lay out some take-home points here on the foot before we move on to the hips and the spine,
sure,
it sounds like what we would recommend for people to do is to, first of all, if you haven't identified that, strengthening your feet and paying attention to foot health and the implications of global health from poor foot health are substantial, then I don't think you've been listening to this episode. So that's definitely something that we would prioritize for our listeners to take on the challenge. And it's not easy. Like I clearly stated, I've been working on this now for over a year, and I would say that I still face challenges. And I'm still paying the price for the 35 years that I was doing it suboptimally. So take on the challenge of strengthening your feet, take on the challenge of gaining mobility, dexterity, and connecting with your feet in your pedal stroke. And then the other thing I would say is that what I'm hearing from Colby is that it's good to understand the movement that's happening in your feet, even in your pedal stroke. I know a lot of people are panicking. They're like, oh, I have movement in my shoe. This is terrible. Embrace that. Understand what that is, right? And then learn how to embrace it. And you need to identify if the movement is actually helping you generate force. If that's what your movement pattern is, your body's telling you like, hey, we need to move this way to get more power in the motion that we're doing, right? Go through that mental discovery and try to find out if that movement that you're maybe thinking is a bad thing is actually what your body is telling you to do to generate more force in the action that you're doing. So go through that little bit of a mental discovery process. Anything I missed on the take homes?
I would add a couple to that. I'd say I agree with your statement about exploring movement within the shoe, especially with the foot and ankle within the shoe. Just keep in mind, we are talking about very small movements. We're not talking about gross, a lot of movement in any particular way. Cycling is it is somewhat of a linear sport. At least that's the attempt, right? We have all these stiff cranksets and bottom brackets and all the things that want us to go in a straight line. So the paradox there is that we are triplanar creatures who make power in spirals, but we're asking our bodies to move in a linear fashion on the bike. That's one of the reasons it causes challenges in the hips and spine. So we'll get to that. But we're looking for small movements potentially in the foot. But if the movement in the cycling shoe is causing you pain or hot spots or blisters, that's a no-fly zone. We're not here to suggest that that's a good thing. That requires further diagnosis. And maybe you might need to go look for some shoes that fit a little better and capture the energy of your natural movement patterns more effectively. The other thing I would add is, just as you've noted, Zach, it is quite easy for people to decide to improve the function of their feet, go down the road of purchasing some barefoot shoes or maybe some 5-finger shoes or start walking barefoot, doing foot exercises. And just as you learned, you can give yourself plantar fasciitis or fasciosis pretty easily. And this goes back to my original comment about how we can take walking for granted at times. It's just human nature. Man, you don't want to injure your feet. Injuring your feet, there are a few things you don't want to injure anything, but groins, ribs, and feet take forever to heal.
Okay.
Why do feet take forever to heal? Because you use them every day. So unless you go plop yourself in a wheelchair, there's no chance to rest, right? You injure your knee cycling, you take 2 weeks off and kill it usually, a week off, right? If you're smart. But it's really hard to take time off your plantar fascia, the plantar fascia that run under the underside of the foot, because we weight those and load them every step we take. So what I'm saying is, go with caution, my friend. Really, you do take this adventure under task. Don't go too deep too fast. Drip feed, don't waterboard these types of foot exercises, and focus on building the integral arch shape. That's the key to having a strong, stable foot, so that everything above the foot can move naturally and in alignment.
So some practical tools for you guys. I feel like this is really important to lay out now that we've highlighted how hard it can be and what potential risks you may face in taking on this journey. That doesn't mean throw your current cycling shoes in the garbage and switch to something of a different shape. That doesn't mean start walking barefoot everywhere you go, right? If you're going to switch shoes or explore new shoes, try them on easy rides, short, easy rides. Keep your current shoes, the way you have them set up, and explore new options on short, easier rides, and slowly build up over the course of 3, 4, 5 weeks, time in the changed or subbed out product that you'd like to use or start using.
Same rule for walking. If you're a big hiker, or maybe you have a dog and you walk your dog twice a day, so you're walking an hour a day in 2 30-minute segments, you switch to barefoot shoes. If they're really extreme and they feel crazy to you, take a little backpack, put your old shoes in your backpack, walk for 5 minutes in the new shoes, change to the old ones. When your feet get tired, change. So same rule applies. Drip feed, don't waterboard. If you get 20 minutes from the house and your ankles are on fire, you've done too much. We don't want you to go that fast.
Great points. Okay, let's move on. Let's get into, it's hard to put priority over one region of the body over another, but I feel like the hips in the pelvic region is something that a lot of riders struggle with. Mobility in the hips, activation of the glutes. This is kind of an area that doesn't really get a lot of attention. If it does get a lot of attention, a lot of the information that I do see going out is not necessarily always helpful. And so when we think about our hip health, Colby, and the mobility of our hips and the impact that our hips have on our daily life and how that translates into performance on the bike, how would you look at explaining that in a nutshell?
So for me, I think about the primal movement patterns that are needed for us to perform on the bike. And the first thing we do when we get on the bike, we put our foot or our leg over the top tube, right? Maybe we clip one foot in, we slide her up back in the saddle, and we push forward and we hinge forward to get to the bars. So the primary requirement of cycling is to hinge at the hip. And so when we have a good hip hinge that's healthy, we're using the glute to drive power, and we're using the glute to support that torso as we hinge forward. And that's a healthy relationship to have to that activity. However, there are many cyclists I see who have we'll say a suboptimal ability to hinge at the hip. And when they roll forward, when they reach forward for the bars, instead of hinging around an axis of rotation in the center of the hip stays where it is and the back flexes forward. They do a forward bend of the spine to get to the bars. And this has multiple implications. The first of which is that it impacts your breathing pattern potentially negatively because you fold over the diaphragm. The second is it puts more strain on the discs of the spine, depending on where you're folding forward in the spine. The most common is the lumbar area, right? L5S1 is the most commonly injured disc area in the body. And the third one would be glute function. So if you want to test this, go try and do a light body weight squat, we'll say, with your butt tucked under, pelvis tucked, and try a few reps and see what happens. Then roll your butt out, stick your butt out, and you'll feel those glutes fire, right? And if you want to know if a muscle's innervating under load, just go to the bottom of that squat and hold it, and then just reach back and touch that muscle. Just tap it with your finger. When it's innervated, you'll feel it firing, right? So the hip hinge is really the primary requirement of cycling. It gives us all these gifts when we do it correctly. The challenge of that hip hinge is we have to have the mobility to do it, right? So the muscles of the posterior chain have to allow us to get into that hip hinge. Some people have really tight lower backs. Some people have really tight hamstrings. Some people have other tight body parts that prevent them from hinging forward to get to the bars with that neutral spine. And then some other challenges are that we have a bike seat in between our legs. And if the saddle is we'll say the wrong shape for that rider, when they try to roll their pelvis forward, what happens is you get an increase in perineal pressure. So oftentimes riders are actually sitting on a saddle that's not right for them. And the way they handle that is they roll their pelvis back so that they get less pressure in their crotch. And then they're riding around in a suboptimal position, or even worse, they're kind of wrestling with that front of that saddle and they're really quite uncomfortable. Maybe they're having numbness or saddle sores or pain or tingling, which none of us want, none of us need to tolerate, especially now in bike fitting. We've got so many good saddles that are such good options for so many riders. Nobody needs to deal with that. So instead, they're kind of battling this constant pain in the crotch to try to ride in that good position and feel those glutes working. And this is an unfortunate circumstance. We don't want to see athletes dealing with that pain and discomfort, right? There's necessary discomfort when you're riding a bike, like your legs and your lungs hurt because you went hard. And there's unnecessary discomfort, which is when your feet are asleep because your shoes are too tight or the wrong shape, or your saddle's the wrong shape and it's causing you numbness or pain in your genitals. This is no fly zone.
So you mean to tell me that more chamois cream is not the solution?
That is correct. Slathering yourself in Vaseline or chamois cream will not solve this problem. In fact, often it makes it worse.
Get out of here. Wow, what a surprise.
Another unpopular opinion.
I'm on the no chamois cream team, baby. There's time and a place, a very limited time and a place for some chamois cream, but I'd say, dude, I don't remember last time I used chamois cream, and why would I? Because it was probably not a good memory to have. With that in mind, when you look at, because like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, you've been a fitter for 10 years, right? So if you were to identify the most performance restricting movement patterns of the pelvis, what would you kind of chalk those up in a list?
That's a good question. Probably the single biggest one is limitation of hip flexion, right? So let's define that so people know what we're talking about. That's basically bringing your knee towards your chest. And we have to bring our knee close to our chest in cycling, kind of independent of almost any aspect of the discipline at some point, either for aerodynamic considerations, because as we drop the torso more towards horizontal, then that angle between the femur and the torso gets to be sharper, more acute, smaller, right? But let's say you're a rider who's like, well, I don't really care about aerodynamics. I'm not doing time trials. I'm not racing. I'm not doing criteriums. So I just like to putz along, doing this. That's fine. I'm not here to tell you how to ride your bike, but I will say that when we bring that torso more horizontal, bikes handle better, right? Especially road bikes, but all bikes to a certain point will handle better. So we're talking not just about aerodynamics, which isn't only competitive, it's also fun to go fast on a bike, right? I mean, if you do a flat ride and you average 16 miles an hour and I improve your position without making a single extra watt, now you can go 18 miles an hour, That's pretty cool. But handling, again, you don't have to be a screaming maniac on the downhills. That's not necessarily the objective. We're not talking only about people who want to win the U.S. Crit Series. We're talking about people who want to go down hills quickly but safely, right? And so if I had a rider's given maximum speed, we'll call this their absolute flat out, like almost on the verge of death in every corner speed. I call this your cheetah speed because it's a thought experiment where you're being attacked or chased by a cheetah, right? And then some percentage below that is your JRA speed. You're just riding along speed. That'd be the speed you take on a descent when you're just not in any particular hurry, you're just enjoying riding your bike. And for most people, if their cheetah speed is 100%, their JRA speed is somewhere around 40, 50, 60%, right? But as your skills improve, as your bike position improves, and as your mobility improves and allows you to ride in that low horizontal position, your JRA speed approaches your cheetah speed without assumption of any additional risk. So now you're going at 85% or 90% of your cheetah speed, but you're perfectly safe. And that makes cycling really fun. In fact, you and I have one of those experiences today coming down one of the big local climbs. We weren't going super fast at all, but we were going quite a bit faster than many riders would feel comfortable because our JRA speed is a good percentage. It's a higher percentage of our race speed.
Well, I think what most people don't understand about the hip hinge in particular is that if you have the ability to really control the dexterity of your torso becomes another speed mitigator. So you can slow down your speed by raising your torso up slightly going into the corner and then without touching your brakes, right? So you can raise your torso up as you're entering the corner and then tuck your torso down closer to your handlebars as you're exiting the corner to use the corner to take speed, right? So you enter the corner, get control, and exit faster. Yep. And that'll throw 99% of amateur riders off because they're like, how did this guy go through the corner so fast? But really, you took it in full control. And there's certainly an art to riding your bike fast, but skillfully and safe. Yep. And I'd say that being able to hip hinge and execute dexterity of your torso has a big impact in that. Even in these just small little transitions over rollers, right? You get to the top of a roller, right, where you had your torso a little bit more upright, you're catching a little bit more wind to get more leverage on your handlebars and breathe a little bit more clearly as you're coming up a little climb. And then as soon as you get to the top, you naturally drop down into a more aerodynamic position, even if you're not racing. Right? You could be doing this in zone 2 or aerobic endurance, right? And still be going faster. So it's a really interesting way to put that. So you've talked about the things that hold people back, and we just briefly kind of talked about some advantages. What would you say some of the things are that people need to focus on to improve their hip mobility and hip health and hip dexterity to perform better in cycling?
Yeah. So I would say we want to understand what the range of movement required is on the bike, right? And there's different ways to do that. You could take a film of yourself and you could even draw some lines and figure out some angles if you were so inclined. You could look at the maximum point of hip flexion, that is where your knee comes closest up to your torso, and the maximum point of hip extension. And we could ensure that you have good ability to generate power and stability beyond those angles, right? I think this is a mistake commonly made in bike fitting, and I've made this mistake myself as a young rider. We think that because we can pull the knee to a certain angle, right? I can flatten it to my chest, that it's okay for me to ride my bike with that same angle. Well, let's think about this for a second. A joint has a given range of movement, however many degrees. We'll just say 180 for the sake of example, maybe in the elbow, right? But if I went to go do a bicep curl, I couldn't make the same force over that whole path of 180 degrees. Of course not. I'd be strongest in the middle, but at the end ranges, either here or here, I'd be extremely weak potentially, right? So we have to understand that even a well-trained rider, even Jean-Claude Van Damme, makes less force at end range of his joints than he does in the middle, right? Now, he's particularly good at making force at end range too. That's why he can kick someone in the head. But we want to understand that there's a coupling of joint end range and a lack of force most of the time. So what I'm saying is we don't want to be having our knee come all the way up to our chest if we can't make force there, because the joint's going to be unstable there. And if you go on a simple 90-minute bike ride and you average 90 RPM, that's over 8,000 pedal strokes. So that's a lot of joint wear in an unstable position if you're at joint end range. So what I'm saying is you want to work with a qualified bike fitter to establish what your joint ranges are and then set up your bike fit to be a subset of that, so you're not going to end range.
So the main things you're communicating here are saddle height, which would, portray a lot of pelvic tilt.
Yep.
Right? If the saddle's too high, you're going to be leaning one side to the other.
Potentially.
Right? Yeah. Which I've seen many times. And the crazy thing is, like, I had this one athlete join the program. I won't mention any names. Almost a year ago now. But when they came into the program, their saddle was 8 centimeters too high, and they'd worked with many coaches.
Say that again to make sure everyone knows.
8
centimeters.
8 centimeters.
That's like 4.5, 5 inches, right?
Unbelievable.
Like the wrong zip code.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like unbelievable. This person was very strong, good power numbers, but I'd never seen them ride in person. And as soon as I saw them on their bike, we didn't get out of the parking lot, and I was like, stop right now.
What are you doing?
Yeah.
How are you riding your bike?
The whole time we've been working together, you've been telling me how unique you are and how you have to get custom, suits made. And when I saw your bike in the room with all the other bikes at a camp, I was like, why is this one saddle so jacked up out of this bike? Like, this is so weird. I've never seen a saddle so high, right? It was just totally, completely weird. And this particular athlete had absolutely zero glute recruitment. I'm telling you, like, if you were to hold this person's butt while doing a squat, they would not even be able to feel your hands on the muscles of their butt. They feel it on the skin, but they had no dexterity or feeling in their glute muscles at all. So we lowered the saddle, right? We started doing some corrective exercise. The only way this person could get glute activation was with glute bridges, squats, nothing else would engage the glutes at all. Even banded monster walks, nothing would get glute engagement other than we had to start with glute bridges, right? So we went through this long journey of, like, connecting this person with, their saddle height, which again, comes back to your point about pelvic. Well, you were kind of hitting on it. I kind of brought it up, but mitigating pelvic tilt, right? So that's one of the main things we don't want to execute is pelvic tilt, because if we're overextending the joint, then there's just such a much higher percentage of the pedal stroke that's not optimally driving force and generating wear on the joints, right?
Yep.
So that's one thing. There was something else on my mind that I wanted to mention that's not coming to me right now, so perhaps we just move on. But is there anything else you want to cover on, and keep in mind, for all the listeners, like, we've just filmed, I think, like 8 hours on each course, on each of these topics. So there's so much more to go into that we can't go into on this podcast. But if you're feeling like you're identifying, or you might have any of these issues that we're highlighting, then I strongly recommend Colby's courses. But before we move on to the spine, is there anything you feel like we need to cover on the hips and pelvic?
Yeah, I would say the big thing that I see quite a bit in my fit studio, and a lot of riders come to me with this challenge, this bleeds into the spine as well, is this global spiral pattern, right? This sense of twistedness around the bike, which can manifest in many ways. And this is directly related to the hips and really muscle recruitment patterns and firing patterns, neurological firing patterns on the bike most often. And so the common denominator is, if you look at a rider, if you're riding as if you're on their wheel, right? Or I'll film them in the studio with an iPad and I'll show them so they can see it. Sometimes riders will figure this out, often not. But what we'll see is we'll watch the hips, and one will be either statically lower than the other or shifted forward towards the handlebars, or a combination of both, right? So there's this real sense of kind of a tilt from when you're looking at them as if you were riding on their wheel. There's a sense that their pelvis is tilted or rotated or both. And sometimes it happens just sort of stuck that way, but often it's happening dynamically. So what we see is one hip is rolling forward and down. It's almost as if one hip follows the foot as it pedals. So it's like this kind of action. The one hip is glued to the foot and the other one's just sort of hanging out. And this can be quite maddening for a rider to experience because we don't really have a way to see our own butts while we ride unless we have a buddy who films us.
Right.
And so riders put together all these clues, right? And the clues can be numerous. It's like, I'm getting IT band pain on one side. When I get on the massage table, one quad is really tired and the other hamstring's really tired. I just feel like I'm twisted, but I'm always shifting in the saddle. And no matter what I do, I feel twisted or windswept. I get pain on one side of my lower back and the other. Another one is I get saddle sores on one side always, but not the other. And another one is I feel like I'm hanging off one side of the saddle, not the other, right? Or all my weight is supported on one sit bone, not the other. These are all common reports. But it can also manifest in knee pain on one side or the other, shoulder pain, because it changes your weight distribution up the chain. So this is a global spiral. It's a global rotation that happens on the bike. And unfortunately, I think what this boils down to is credit card interest, meaning few cents over each month, and then it grows over time into this giant unmanageable pile. That's what happens with spirals, right? Unfortunately. So we all have tiny asymmetries. The bike, unfortunately, brings out and propagates those asymmetries. It's sort of a machine that's meant to do that because we move in spirals, but the bike asks us to move in this linear fashion. And if we're unaware of how these spiral patterns are manifesting, then they just sort of keep going. So that's something we talk about quite a bit in the course, is that spiral pattern, that asymmetry in the hips.
I think you also highlight the danger in emulating a lot of pro riders. And I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus here with this statement, but I remember the first time I rode with Peter Sagan. And it was towards, not the end of his career. He was on Bora 2018, I think. So he still won some races, right? But I remember just like riding behind him for the first time, looking at him and being like, this guy's completely crooked on his bike. And so it's like, for all the entrepreneurs out there, it's like your customer lifetime value, right? The longer you plan on doing this, the more taking care of your body really matters, right? The more paying attention to people and things really matter, because with Sagan, when he retired, like he couldn't keep up anymore. And it's not that he wasn't talented and that he wasn't strong. It's that he wasn't efficient in his movement patterns anymore because they were disorganized, in my opinion, right? And of course, he had some health complications and things of that nature, but those are all compounding interest, to your credit card points, on things that were maybe not addressed. And so I feel like I see a lot of professional riders getting away with what I would consider bad movement patterns because they are extremely talented and strong and tough, right? And so these things, I just want to point it out to the audience that it's never a good idea to look at the pro rider and say, such and such did this, so
That's such a good point.
You explain it to me how they're able to do it.
That's such a good point. So we have to understand that pros are often succeeding in spite of, not because of, and they have an army of people to hold them together with duct tape and super glue, literally in some cases, right? They get massages all the time. They've got kinesio tape going everywhere. They've got physios. They've got all sorts of modalities to help them deal with these chronic injuries and niggles they experience from these asymmetries.
Daily massage and physio and chiro.
So you can manage a lot of problems with that. And when you have to throw a soldier into battle, which that's how World Tour teams operate, they're in battle. We need to tape up our soldiers and send them to the field, right? So I want to be clear about that. It's a big problem for me as a fitter because people do come to me with these types of questions. They say, well, you're asking me to ride this way and I see this person riding that way. What's the deal? And, human bodies are infinitely complex, right? Fractally complex. So I'm not telling you any particular rider can't succeed or win a bike race if their pelvis isn't aligned to my standards. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is you have to know yourself as an athlete and know where your limitations are, right? And then you have to work to improve those factors or those functional limitations so that you can express your highest athletic potential. There's a big difference between that and watching someone else on the videotape of Tour de France or whatever live feed saying, well, they're really crooked and they ride like this, and so it doesn't really matter. This is not the way sports work.
So I remember now what I was going to say when I went on my tangent about saddle height.
Okay.
So the other thing that can have a big implication on your pelvic stability and maximizing the force of your range of motion is crank arm length.
Yes.
Right. So this is something, I mean, you've just been talking about it so much on this trip down here. On all your other bikes, you have 165s. Of course, we know Pogacar is riding 165s right now. You've been playing around with 160s, and you've been telling me about some of the discussions you've been having internally around, why you've decided to explore this and where's the bottom of the barrel, so on and so forth. So what kind of implications can crank arm length have on a rider's pelvic health and power transfer and performance in cycling?
Yeah, great question. So as we hinge forward to grab the bars, right? We're talking about that pelvis rolling forward, rotating forward. If you have a limit in the amount of flexion you can tolerate, that's the amount that your knee can come towards your chest. Well, one of the most elegant ways to solve that problem or work around that range of motion limitation is to put shorter cranks on. So, if a rider comes to me and they're dreadfully inflexible, they've only been riding their bike, flying around the country in their jet and sitting at their desk all the time, and they want to go to shorter cranks, I might say in the short term, that's a reasonable solution, but I will also caution them that that's a giant Band-Aid to their problem and it won't really get to the root of the issue. On the other hand, if we have an athlete who's doing functional work off the bike, they've got good range of motion in the hips, but maybe they have a hip impingement where their femur bone literally hits the top of their hip socket, right? This happens. Or they have another reason why they cannot achieve a certain angle, then shorter cranks might be a very elegant solution for them that can help them enjoy riding a bike for much longer. So the old school line of thought was a longer crank equals more leverage equals more power. And that's not untrue. However, what people miss is there are about 40 more things that impact a rider's function and ability to make power once we go to that longer crank length. It comes with a lot of drawbacks. Drawbacks in pelvic stability, right? Drawbacks in a greater need for hip range of motion, a greater neural drive from a larger pedal circumference with a higher foot speed. And not only do you have to maintain that foot speed, but you have to maintain force over that higher pedal circle. So when we add up all the negatives for long cranks, what we come up with is a list of riders who are arguably justified in using longer cranks that's very short. I would say that list consists of someone who's getting paid to ride their bike, somebody who's trying to win a climbing specialist, and probably trying to win stages in the Vuelta. Because every year at the Vuelta, they have about half a dozen stages that finish on a road like this. Yeah. And at that moment, a long crank will probably help you go faster in most cases. But for everyone else, the cons of riding long cranks almost always outweigh, the cons of riding long cranks almost always outweigh the potential pros of riding a short crank, for sure.
I think we discussed on a ride earlier this week too, the really massive changes in the way athletes ride their bikes because of the changes in the gear ratios that we have now, right? Like Merckx and Hino and these riders back in the day, they didn't have the gear range that we have today, so they'd be slid all the way back on the saddle using their glutes and just riding their bike in a completely different way than Pogacar and Remco and Carapaz are riding their bikes today. And that also should reflect the components we use and the shapes and sizes of them. So I'm going over to the UK this weekend, and I'm going to switch my group set out, and I'm going to try. Do you think I should try 160s or 165s?
You're on 70s now, right?
170s, yeah.
I mean, that's a great question. Where's the bottom, right? So hard one to answer. I would say minimum 5 mils is the change, but if you really want to find out, just put 60s on and see how it goes. Right.
Cool. All right.
Data point. You won't know until you try it.
Well, I'm going to give it a shot. I will let you know how it goes, and I'll let all the listeners know as well.
Perfect.
Post it on Instagram or something.
Awesome experiment.
So let's keep moving up the body. Let's get into the spine. Obviously, you touched earlier on one of the most common injury points in the body of the spine being in the L4 and L5, the lumbar region of the spine. And I think one of the reasons is that the bike, for a lot of people, especially those with limited mobility, is an extension of the office chair that we sit in. The only difference is we don't do 400 watts in our office chair. We are not doing maximal efforts in a bad anatomical position for our body in our office chair. So when we basically go through the same movement pattern in our chairs and on our bikes, we really, again, just limit the amount of, to your point, our bodies are made to move. We limit the amount of mobility in the spine in our day-to-day activity by just doing office work and driving in our cars and riding our bikes. So we can understand why, limited mobility is very common in the spine in cycling. But if you were to take a step back and we were just to look at the spine's place in the human body, the purposes that it serves, and what its impacts are on the performance side in cycling, where would you start with that conversation?
So I think of the spine as it's a conduit for our nervous system, right? It's also the support system for the organs. The organs hang off of the spine. And so the spine supports a tremendous amount of weight, right? And all that weight is focused down on the sacrum, which takes us back to the relationship of the spine and the hips. So the hips will move a little bit around the sacrum, and the sacrum supports the weight of the spine and the organs. I like to think of the spine like a hose, and hoses don't like to be kinked. So when we're riding our bikes, if our sacrum and our hips won't allow us to hinge forward around that axis of rotation in the center of the hips, the spine takes that load. And sometimes we see riders who have what we'll call global flexion in the spine, right? Think of someone whose back is kind of shaped like a rainbow, a nice gentle arc. And that's not ideal, I would say. It's not the worst scenario because we have gentle flexion distributed over multiple vertebrae.
So just for the audience, can you use the same example that we use in all the courses on flexion and extension?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So easy terms to define flexion and extension. Flexion can apply to any joint in the body. And whenever we think of flexion, we're moving towards the fetal position, right? We're curling up into a little ball. Whenever we're extending, we're moving away from the fetal position. So again, that applies to every joint. The spine can go into extension or flexion, the arms, the knees, etc. So when we're talking about spinal flexion in that global pattern that's shaped like a rainbow or a turtle's shell, right? We think of a lot of cyclists who look like that. And that's the second case scenario. Worst case scenario for me is when we have a distinct acute point of flexion in the spine, which instead of it looking like a nice curved rainbow, we have sort of a kink in the hose, right? And that means the point of flexion is very focused around maybe one or two vertebrae. And that makes me uncomfortable, not because I'm a soothsayer or I can see the future. If I had to look in my crystal ball, knowing what I know about spines, I know that spines don't behave well to that type of continual flexion generally. I can't say whether any one person will have a problem down the road, but I wouldn't put money on them maintaining spinal health if they ride around with a kink in their spine all the time. So we really want to work towards a nice extended spine. The cue that I like to offer my riders in my fit studio and the athletes that I coach is to focus on axial extension of the spine, which is basically what mom told us to do in high school, stand up straight. So we're making the distance from our pelvic floor to the crown of our head as long as possible. That's axial extension of the spine.
Now that doesn't mean executing too much extension or overextending where your spine is now, rounded in the opposite direction. Let's get into some of the great performance benefits of executing good posture in your spine on the bike. We saw this guy flying up the climb today. He blasted by us. And I was a little bit critical of his form and how he was riding his bike. And you're like, what do you see? And I'm like, he's a chest breather. He's only breathing in his chest. And I could see it in his spine, actually. He was just taking short breaths all in the upper part of his chest and not actually fully filling his lungs in a three-dimensional way down into his rib cage. I see these things. When people ride by me, we can identify what their effort is sometimes by their breathing patterns and the intensity that their body is demonstrating. So when we look at the potential benefits of being able to improve your breathing with good spinal posture, what else, beyond just improved breathing? And maybe there's more to go into on the breathing side, but what can we start to discuss in terms of benefits, performance benefits to good posture in your spine while you're cycling?
So one of the challenges I think for cycling coaches and bike fitters and cyclists is that we tend to think of cyclists or cycling as really only a lower limb sport, right? It's dominated by legs. My legs hurt. My legs are tired. I push hard with my legs. I make power with my legs. And we think of the entire upper body as this more or less passive thing that just sort of slumps over the bike, and you support yourself on the bars a little bit, kind of T-Rex style, and you stand up out of the saddle and kind of weave the bike around, right? The reality is that in order for us to perform any truly athletic activity, we utilize our entire body. And we can illustrate this point really simply. You go for a really long, really hard ride, come home, every muscle will hurt. Your forearms will hurt, your triceps will hurt, your biceps will hurt, your deltoids will hurt. So we've used all of our muscles in cycling to some degree, and we do use all of our muscles. Maybe not to their full range and maybe not to their force capacity, but they are being utilized. So what we want to think about in terms of the spine, it's not only a conduit for the nervous system, it's also a conduit of force. And it's the connection between the upper control center, the shoulder girdle, and the lower control center, that's the hips. And these two control centers, right, we call them control centers because they often originate force generation, whether you're throwing a baseball, pedaling a bike, or sprinting up a hill. These force generation centers, these control centers, need to relate to each other, and they do that primarily via the spine. So when the spine is long and organized, and lightly active, that is a supporting structure, then it connects the shoulder to the hip. And most often in cycling, what we want to see is a clear connection of the contralateral shoulder. So meaning the left shoulder to the right hip, or the left hip to the right shoulder. And so we can see clearly, oftentimes riders have a spiral pattern that's manifesting in one hip. For example, the right hip, they'll have a less stable hip on the right and a little bit of a more stable hip on the left. We'll see that reflected in the left shoulder. So their left shoulder will be less stable. Their left scapula or shoulder blade will be winged, meaning poking up from the back. So they're not learning to tuck their wing and organize the shoulder. And likewise, this right hip is less organized. It's internally rotated. The hip is flaring. The knee is coming in towards the top tube, banging the top tube maybe, or they have an excessive internal spiral in the foot. And that is a nice way to remind everyone that while we've broken these courses into 3 separate categories, spine, hips, and foot and ankle, it's really a system. And we have to look at all the pieces of that system as one continuous structure of muscles, ligaments, fascia, bone, soft tissue. Everything moves and works together. Nervous system connects together. This is how we make force on the bike truly.
So as you mentioned there, and we've touched on several times throughout this discussion today, is that things are all really connected, right? And so while many athletes think of the sport as a sport from the hips down and one that only involves sheer leg strength, the connection with your hands on your handlebars and how even that connection is from one side to the other really plays a big impact. And so we're talking about systemic dexterity and control of your movement patterns, organizing those movement patterns, and really bringing everything that you do and every movement that you make into consideration, right? And not just going through the motions of things. And so just to start to close out here on this episode, how would you describe the importance of organizing your movement patterns as a whole in your body, and what kind of performance gains can you get from doing so in the sport of cycling?
Yeah, great question. So I think organization of movement is everything, right? I mean, we're really talking about attention to details. The devil's in the details, as they say. And cycling is a sport of details. There's no doubt about it. But it's easy for us to attend to our tire pressure, or our gear choice, or our tire width, or, whatever other little things we're worried about, the alignment of our leg band on our tan line. It's less common for riders to be attentive to their form or how they're delivering power, their posture on the bike, their breathing patterns on the bike. And this is, I think, where there's a lot of gold. The challenge with that type of intent is that we've carved out a very big canyon. So what I mean by that is I often use the analogy of a river, right? When you're a child, your movement patterns take the form of, we'll say, a stream. And if we consider each gram or molecule of water as a day in your life or a movement you make, over time, that tiny stream starts to carve a little bit of a path in the mountain, right? And then by the time you're a teenager, it's a flowing river and you've begun to move in certain ways. Everything you do in life has a certain rhythm, a certain pattern. You walk a certain way, you carry your head a certain way, you carry your center of gravity over the feet. And if you're riding a bike, you begin to associate a certain posture and a way of driving power on the bike, right? You formulate a strategy to make power. And the further we go in life, the more decades we add to our life, the deeper the canyon becomes. And so if that river is pointed in not quite the right direction from a very early age, just like our compound interest problem, we can end up way off course. And so when we get to the point where we are having severe problems with our spiral, or we're on the verge of quitting the sport because of chronic injuries, because of chronic hip pain, chronic knee pain, chronic low back pain, these are quite common, unfortunately, chronic saddle sores, chronic saddle discomfort because of hip instability. These are all common things that I work with in my fit studio, unfortunately. That means our canyon is significantly off target from where we intended it to go. What we wanted to do was have organized movement. We wanted to have our movement and our relationship to sport and our bike be something that had longevity and filled us with vitality. But instead, it's having the outcome where we're ending up injured. And this is just not where we want to be. So how do we move a canyon? Well, the same way we built it, a gram of dirt at a time. And it can be an overwhelming task, but just like any task worth doing, you just take your time and do as much as you can in a given day, and then look back at the end of that day on that progress. And you move in the right direction. We start redirecting our river towards the direction we want to go, which is, of course, the direction of symmetry. Not that symmetry is something that we can ever attain. Humans are, by definition, asymmetrical, but it's an ideal we strive for. Management of our spirals, enjoyment of the bike so that we can achieve that flow state, right? Balance in our production, energy production strategy, or our default mode network on the bike needs to be balanced. That's how I would describe it, which is a pretty vague term, but I think you get the idea. So we want to move that canyon a gram of dirt at a time until it comes more in the direction we're moving. And then the gains you can get from that are tremendous, but they're maybe not the way people think about gains. I think commonly right now in our cycling culture is people are asking, well, can I add 30 watts to my FTP? Can I add 50 watts to my FTP? That's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a much bigger idea, which is that FTP is just one outcome of performance that's crafted over weeks, months, and years of consistent training and attention to detail. And the FTP is the end result of all those days where you took a few minutes to stretch, all those days where you ate properly, all those days where you got to sleep early, all those days where you did the right intervals, not too much, not too little, and you were attentive to your posture and form. That gives you a better FTP in the end, but it also gives you a better base of threshold, a more repeatable training schedule. So you can handle a higher load over time. So we might say the outcome is you become more durable as an athlete. You become harder to kill, right? And that's what we want in our athletes. You're an endurance athlete. Cycling is primarily an endurance sport. So we first must be able to endure the load, not on a single day, but day after day after day after day. That's how we become consistent in our practice of cycling. And we add this tremendous amount of load to our physiology, and then we do things that blow people away, right? We go ride 3 or 4 mountains at 100 miles. We do races that are, to someone who lives on the couch, completely unthinkable. They can't even imagine. And I'm sure you've had this conversation at a party. People say, you're a cyclist? What's your long ride? And you tell them, oh, I go for 160 kilometers. And then they're like, what's a kilometer? You're like, 100 miles. And they're like, I would die if I rode my bike more than 2 miles, right? So that's how you accomplish big things in this sport.
That was really interesting. And I think you can see it in that there are a lot of athletes or former athletes that come from other sports who have had to develop good movement patterns to survive in their sport. They kind of get into cycling and they have this off the couch ability. and you're like, man, like you're a really good rider and you just started riding and you're a lot better than a lot of people who have been doing this for a long time. And a lot of that is just because they're mobile and that they can generate force in an efficient way, whereas people with a lot of these different restrictions in their movement patterns aren't actually able to generate force throughout the entirety of the motion that they're doing. So, some people would chalk that up as talent. Others, would just consider maybe more holistic, well-rounded developmental life path. So it's an interesting discussion in terms of how much performance you can gain from being a more well-rounded athlete, which I think is an easy way to summarize what we're talking here. But to your point there, I think that there is a fundamental problem in people looking for an increase in their FTP as the only way to justify whether or not they've improved. And I think that it can encourage bad coaching practices as well, because, just to be fully transparent with the audience, like it's really not that difficult to take an athlete that's not at the world tour level and get an increase in FTP, because that's what your athlete wants and you want to give your athlete what they want instead of what they actually need. And I think that, when you think about, trying to be a good coach for people, I mean, you and I have these discussions all the time. It's like somebody will bring something up, one of your athletes will bring something up and you'll be like, I can't believe I haven't taught that person something yet, or they didn't know that thing yet. So we're kind of in this position as coaches where it's our duty, to not give the athlete what they think they need and what they want, and help them, because you can't tell people what they should want, but help them build the perspective around what's actually important. Because at the end of the day, like anybody that wants to perform well in cycling needs to hone in on their cycling craft. And cycling craft involves being able to climb a climb eloquently with skill and technique, and to be able to do that at an easy pace or at a high pace and be in control of your effort at all times, right? It also involves being able to go around corners at high or low speeds and being able to be in control of the intensity that you even go downhill at all times, and your ability to maintain momentum over rolling terrain, so on and so forth. And to be in control of your effort from minute 1 to hour 7 is absolutely a massive part of performance and performance improvement, because I know so many people after 2 hours are like, dude, my back is killing me, right? And because they're tough and strong and they're carved up, they can continue to go out there and grind their joints into dust, bone dust, right? And cartilage dust, right? So they can do that. And then they look at their average power and they're like, well, my average power was only about the same, so I haven't really gotten that much better. But if you're able to go out and not feel pain for the first 3 hours and then carry the same power you were riding at from, like I said, from minute 1 to hour 6 or 7, right, you have improved, right? And your technique has improved. And if there was a scenario where you really had to bury yourself to oblivion, you'd probably be able to go harder. But chances are, if you've reached this state of enlightenment, we'll call it, in cycling, FTP tests aren't really that attractive to you anymore. Because they're kind of meaningless, like in a lot of ways. Like I've never once looked at my power meter and a defining moment of competition, or just showing everybody how big our FTPs are right. On the local Hammerfest up the group ride, right? I've never once looked at my power meter and been like, I'm doing good. Right? Like it's not even part of those real world scenarios where you're trying to do maximal efforts. It's all about what you can actually do and how hard you can actually go. And so to the bigger point here, what these courses and these lessons that we've built and the conversation we've had today is designed to do, and it is designed, we put a lot of thought into this, but it's designed to teach people, or to bring consciousness to your movement patterns and the implications and impacts that your movement patterns can have on your cycling performance. And I think it's been a lot today. We've talked about a lot of topics. Before we go ahead and do the closing, Colby, is there anything you feel like we need to add?
Drip feed, don't waterboard. Take it easy on yourself. Be gentle. So many athletes, they're so hard on themselves.
Yeah, that's so true.
Be gentle, man. I mean, train hard on hard days, but don't beat yourself up. Be enough.
Yeah. Also, even to that point, man, like training hard should even feel good. Even the hard days, you should feel good about it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so many people come to me and they've got this idea in their heads that on hard days, it should be like the road race of death and destruction, right? Where you're just nuked. That isn't the model of training we want. Like,
it's so much about rhythm. Rhythm, finding your flow. My best days of training, I've done, literally 5-6 hour rides here where I go and do 4.5 watts per kilo for that duration. And it's never once am I thinking about how hard I'm riding.
Yeah.
You're just in your flow and you're getting after it and it just feels good the whole time. And that's why you're riding that hard.
But it takes you many years and much attention to detail to get to the point where you can perform at that level and have a sense of flow.
Of course.
So wherever your flow state is, whatever watts per kilo it is, that's appropriate for you. You are enough at that moment. That's right for you. So when I say be gentle, what I'm really saying is stop trying to force your performance to someone else's standards. Be good enough for you.
That is such a good piece of advice, and I hope it hits home with a lot of listeners. With that in mind, that's going to be the end of this episode. I want to thank all of you for spending this time with us, and we hope that this podcast has been impactful for you all. We hope that you've learned something, and that you're going to turn this episode off and take these lessons that we've taught you and apply it into your life and become a better athlete, hopefully, through the lessons we've shared with you here today. Colby, I want to thank you, man. So for the listeners, this conversation for me to have with Colby it's a very meaningful one, because 3 years ago when we started this company, Colby's somebody I used to butt heads with a lot on a lot of these topics. And through failing and learning the hard way, I've realized that a lot of what Colby has said to me years ago was actually true. And so to sit here and have this conversation with you guys, it's been very impactful. Colby, thank you for coming to Columbia. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with the greater cycling community and everybody who's interested in solving some problems that they have going on. It's meant a lot to have you here. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. We are blessed.
All right, everybody, we're not exactly sure when these courses that we're talking about are going to be coming out. So if you're listening to this episode and the courses are not out yet, go to teamefcoaching.com. You need to subscribe to the newsletter, get your email in our ecosystem so you can get notified about things that are coming up in the Team EF coaching world. Obviously, notifications like, hey, these courses that we're talking about are live. That would be important to be notified about. Also, we have the Team EF coaching app now live. So if you are one of our current coaching members, you can download the Team EF coaching app in the iPhone store. At this date today, it's only available for iPhone, not for Samsung yet. So you can download the Team EF coaching app and access many of our current available courses. If you are a premium member, you have access to some of our new Skills Academy courses. You have access to the Standing Skills Academy course, which we filmed last year. But there are many, I think we have 140 educational videos already in the library. So if you're interested in checking those out, you can sign up directly for the app. All of that information and so much more can be found at teamefcoaching.com. As I said, thank you everybody for tuning in. That is it for this episode. From Team EF Coaching to the rest of the world, be safe, ride strong, enjoy yourselves.
Thank you.